Welcome to the AccessTruth Podcast, exploring challenging issues currently impacting missions in a rapidly changing world. The AccessTruth Podcast with Paul Mack.
Well, today I'm privileged to be talking with Dr. Mike Matthews, cross-cultural church planner and author and missions trainer, among other things, and author of A Novel Approach, The Significance of Story in Interpreting and Communicating Reality. So welcome, Mike. We're grateful to have the opportunity to chat today.
Good to be here with you, Paul. Thank you for the opportunity. Much appreciated.
So from reading your book and a bit of online research, I know you're married to Kathleen and you have 4 children and 2 grandchildren who, with total objectivity, you describe as amazing. I remember reading, but you've lived in and worked in Siberia and Alaska, now northern Idaho, I think. But given that a lot of your writing, your book, and the things you teach focus on story, I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit of your own story, Mike. Just, what's how God's led you guys in your ministry and what you're doing today.
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to, Paul. I'll give you the nutshell version of the story, the shortened story. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana, a non-Christian home, but it was a home, I think, that had a fair bit of the Judeo-Christian roots, a fair bit of drinking, alcoholism, some things that went on in that regard. But we knew we were family, and as kids, we were loved. Anyway, there was pretty much an absence of God, other than mentioned pretty much daily in swear words. After high school, in a small high school in northeast Montana, then I went to Montana State University, scholarship, a wrestling scholarship, and took wildlife biology. Graduating from that, went to Alaska to work as a wildlife biologist. And it was in Alaska, a little town called Kenai, Alaska, where I wandered into a church on a Sunday morning. It was raining that particular Sunday morning, so I couldn't go out hiking and camping and things I wanted to do on a normal weekend. I wandered into church, and it was there, that particular group of people, that particular message that God used to draw me to himself. Probably over the course of the next couple of weeks, just interacting with his word and with those people, that I saw that I was in desperate need of something beyond myself, and that the answer was in God and in his word and in what he had done through Christ. I suppose about a year after that, I was married to Kathleen. She had 2 little girls at the time because her first husband had been killed in a plane accident in Alaska. He was flying for a mission organization, actually. He was killed. Then Kathleen and I got married, worked for Fish and Wildlife for another few years. Then we joined as an associate missionary in a little village, a place called Tanacross, Alaska, Athabascan village. We worked there for 6 years, and I barely knew the books of the Bible. Well, I should say that more honestly, I didn't know the books of the Bible. But I was there trying to do the best that I could just to help some of the native people there. After a few years of that, I saw the need to go to Bible school. So we went to Prairie Bible Institute in Three Hills, Alberta. And after that, then we joined a mission in Canada. Worked there for a number of years, and then we went to Siberia, as you mentioned, for about 6 years in the late 1990s. And now we're back in the States and doing some consulting work with mission organizations, training in cross-cultural methodology. So that's it in a nutshell, Phil.
Yeah, thank you. And you're actually working with creating a organization or a training organization right now. I know A Novel Approach is one of the names I've heard. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We started an organization here it's registered in the state of Idaho. It's actually a for-profit organization, although we're pretty confident we're not going to make any profit. But it's called A Novel Approach Consulting. organization. And through that organization, we'd like to help train cross-cultural workers in how to effectively and efficiently, as it were, exegete another culture so that we can really understand them at a pretty deep level, worldview level, at least, Paul, and then be able to better communicate the gospel message because of that. So
good. I'm keen to hear and track more as that develops more. I wonder if, just by way almost of illustrating some of the principles in your book and that you're helping with people with, but I wonder if you could describe maybe one or two of the grand stories, as you call them, that you've lived amongst, perhaps in Alaska or Siberia, or both would be good. Just in general, what are the grand stories that you've lived amongst, to give an illustration of what you're describing?
Sure. And maybe for sake of simplicity, I might start with the story that I grew up in Montana ranch land. That's the one that's most familiar to me, obviously, although it's like most of the grand stories that we live in, we aren't very much aware of our own grand story, because it's just it's like the fish in the water. We don't even realize we're in water. But after thinking about this whole thing, I've gone back and tried to revisit that whole thing and to see that there was a grand story there that was the U.S. story. But within that U.S. story, there was the Montana story, which is a little bit more refined. And if you look at the characters and the setting and the plot of that story, it falls within the U.S. story. That began with a few pilgrims leaving England and coming over and fighting a war with England, which our neighbors to the north didn't do. Canada didn't do that. The U.S. did. I'm half Canadian, half U.S., so I'm a little bit schizophrenic here in terms of my patriotism. But I do notice that in America, the concept of patriotism and fighting for our freedom is much more prevalent than it is with the Canadian half of me. So that part enters into the grand story, that key story that happened in the past of the Revolutionary War. Then the Montana part comes in, where the whole Western movement, where the U.S. was trying to spread its wings and its territory, take over more land, that dominion kind of a mindset, and how that's prevalent in Montana in terms of survival, individualism, that comes out perhaps even a bit stronger than if I'd have grown up in New Jersey or someplace like that. And the concept of guns, fighting, out of that Montana story, the railroad story of how we even got here, all of those things enter in. Then in living next to a number of First Nations reserves, how the whole concept of us and them enters in. And I must admit here, probably I grew up with a mindset. I'm just going to be pretty blunt and honest here with you, Paul, that we were better than them, stronger than them. All that was tacit. Nobody actually ever said that, but we grew up with that mindset, probably to some of my shame at this point. But that's a bit of an idea about how a grand, we live within a grand story. Let me saw that with the Athabascans there in Alaska. They had a grand story that was much different. Their grand story included quite a bit dealing with spirit and the spirit world, something that the story that I grew up in Montana was almost devoid of, other than a few ghost stories that Grandma would told us and that sort of thing. But in the grand story of the Athabascans, now those spirits were real. They were daily. They had names. Were part of their lives, affected what they did on a daily basis on the trap line as well. So just a brief look at just the concept of meta-narrative or grand story and how we live within it. It determines how we interpret everything,
where talking here just a week or two after the US election, and without going down trails we may not want to go down in that, but it is interesting the way the stories are told. And I heard a commentator or read someone saying that today facts are far less important. They've been subjugated to the narrative, to the story. And so I think it just bears out the things that you're talking about. And that actually shapes people's lives, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And interesting that you should bring up the whole idea of the election and that sort of thing, of which you're right, I don't want to go down to it, and not necessarily going to go into any detail, but just to this aspect that two different groups or two different people can hear the exact same story, see the same thing on internet, and have a completely different interpretation of that story because of the spin that their particular narrative brings to it. Yeah, absolutely. It's very visible, and during these days here in the States.
Most certainly. So just by way of definition, the term story in your book, you describe it as an interpreted account of a series of related events that entail character, setting, and plot. So on the surface, that sounds fairly straightforward, but you're really using, even what you've said so far, Mike, you're using the term story in a broader sense, aren't you, than we might use it in everyday usage. It's really a larger narrative, isn't it? Yes.
I suppose one way we could think of it is that actually using story as a metaphor for all of life. We could say, which makes it broader than just, I'm telling a story now, that it's bigger than just telling a story. We're talking about all of life being actually a sequence of character, setting, and plot over the course of time. So yes, you're right. It's much bigger. And with this emphasis as well, that the story tends to be the actual event or actual things that happened, and the narrative then is the interpretation of that by whomever is then looking at that particular story. I think that's an important distinction. In the book, you take up a significant chunk of space to talk about the grand story of Western culture that has impacted maybe everyone who would read that book, and you trace that story, and I think that's helps to illustrate what you're meaning by story, back to the Enlightenment, moving forward to what's empirically verifiable, and just that. I thought, if I can say, a really good description of that process in Western thought. But why did you consider it important to take that time to describe that? And to be honest, again, I've received some. Well, flack might be too strong of a word, but at least some folks have said, man, that's a long time on the Enlightenment, and perhaps too much time, as some have thought. But the reason it's there was to give an example of what I thought would be a powerful example of a key story that happened even before the beginning of the United States of America, that affects the way Americans and Canadians, and I believe all Westerners, including Europe at this point, and how we think. Something that happened, 300 years ago, and that it's a key story that's a bit different in the sense that it lasts 120 years instead of over a 10-year period, or something like 9/11 story, which happened basically in one day. This is a long story that had tremendous influence on how we think in terms of moving from sort of a focus on the revelation of God as the starting point of how we know everything before the Enlightenment, in Europe, that is, even though not everybody agreed on who God was or how many gods there were, but everybody agreed that it was a theistic mindset anyway. Enlightenment changed all of that. Changed it, turned it upside down, and I wanted to show how powerful something that we don't even talk about. I mean, I grew up in Montana. Believe me, my dad never mentioned the Enlightenment. And I don't remember hearing about it in grade school.
Yeah.
But it was affecting the way we thought. So I just wanted to show how an old story, an old key story that we don't normally talk about affects the way we think.
Well, one reason why, and I'm certainly not one who critiques the amount of time you took, because I felt it was critical to lay that, because one of the things you say in there is that you note that knowledge became more human-based, less divine-based, more context-based and less universal, and more proposition-based and less story-based. So in talking about what is essentially hermeneutics and how we interpret and understand, I felt it was important to give that picture that we don't naturally interpret somebody else, their culture, based on their stories. We want to put it in propositional terms because of that background. So I thought it was critical, actually.
Well, it sounds, Paul, like you know the book better than I do. I think.
Yeah.
I should maybe ask you some questions about what was in there.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that it did is that in moving from story to propositions, just in very general kind of terms, but the move from a revelational kind of epistemology to rational, it just naturally boiled things down to more bullet points. Here's the bullet point of this scientific thing. Bullet point, and man, we can see that in our culture, we tend to like bullet points in terms of teaching. What's the bullet point? What's the main point? But it's pretty hard to get emotional over bullet points. And it's pretty difficult to not get emotional over a story.
We'll be right back in just a moment. But first, here's a free resource from AccessTruth.com.
So the first thing I'll say about narrative is that narrative is universal. Narrative is found in every culture. I want to share a quote with you from Mark Turner. He says, "Story is a basic principle of mind. Most of our experience, our knowledge, and our thinking is organized as stories." That's going to become important when we consider cross-cultural ministry, because when we seek to be able to communicate cross-culturally, we can go into that context with confidence that we're working with peoples who understand story. And we'll see in other tutorials ways in which narrative is so effective in communication. And so we're going to be talking to you about communicating God's meta-narrative, or the biblical story, the meta-story, different terms that we use to refer to that. We're talking about the story of God from creation to the new creation. And so that's one of the beauties of narrative. If we can teach the Word of God in a narrative format, then we draw people into the storyline, not in a forced manner, but we show them where they as a believer are a part of God's plan and work in salvation history. And we see them then become motivated to find their place in the story of God. That's part of the beauty of narrative.
And now back to the Access Truth Podcast with Paul Mack.
Yeah, so you talk about different levels of story, how there's episodes and then key stories and so on, grand stories. Could you just reflect on that a little bit, how those kind of tie together? What's the hierarchy in those?
Well, the whole concept of a grand story, as you know, that's pretty big. And how do you get a hold of a person's or a group of people's grand story? So it seemed obvious that then that has to be broken down. And I happened to be, during that time, I was actually writing a dissertation on the subject I ran across a book called Master Narratives of Islamic Extremists. And in that book, they talk about master narratives of these extremists. Man, I thought they did, by 3 professors out of Arizona State University, they did an absolutely masterful job of showing how 13, what they called master narratives of these extremists, then shape the way these folks are thinking today. Well, the book cost $94 on Amazon at the time, so I bought it. If I'd have known what was in it, I'd have paid 3 times that amount, because it then made real clear the concept of how key stories And a number of key stories, in their view at that time, 13 of these key stories, if you understood them, you would understand the mindset of these folks. So that then triggered, okay, in every group of people's grand story, there's key stories in the past that are main parts that make up that grand story. But then it also became obvious that in any culture, there's the everyday episodes that make up the key stories that make up the grand story. So there was kind of a natural flow there. Then thinking about the analogy of a puzzle, where if you get a box of puzzle pieces and there's no picture, you've got all of the little pieces. Those are the episodes. But then there's the green ones and the red ones and the white ones. So you can sort of cluster them together to make up key stories. Once you put all that together, you've got the grand story. So that kind of a concept, Paul.
Yeah, no, good. And in talking about a grand story as an overarching story that encompasses the whole thing in a culture, I was thinking about the context that we were lived amongst in the South Pacific, communities there back in the 90s, that there was little internal coherence. There are a lot of different stories, and we got those and tried to understand, but they've been impacted by a number of different, including a form of Christianity, traditional beliefs, cargo cult, and other things. So it felt extremely disjointed. It felt like much of their maybe existing grand story had eroded in many ways, or been. Would you agree that's fairly typical, especially these days with, very few places are completely isolated and discrete in their stories. So just in practical terms, how do we contend with that when we're trying to understand a community, a group of people?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct in that today, generally speaking, where missions work and where we all live, there aren't too many places that are, cut off from the rest of the world, and that their own microcosm, and they have nothing to do with the outside world. That's a pretty rare thing these days, and getting more rare with because of technology and that. But I think there that what we have to realize then is that those people still live within some grand story, but that grand story then is affected by other stories that are coming in, that are, and however that comes in, those people are absorbing that and getting some assumptions from that change in their story. Well, then that forms the new modified grand story. And I think that's happening all over the world. As a general rule, with everybody, First Nations people in Canada, Alaska, it's absolutely huge. Urban work, even different tribes coming into an urban area, there's still then that urban story. They still share some of the same characters, the same setting, and the same plot that then makes up, as it were, a new evolutionary grand story that's different from the one that perhaps their grandparents grew up with. Yeah, it's an important distinction. And I think some folks who have read the book say that, well, okay, I can see how this works in a monoculture, but it's not going to work in a multicultural situation, to which I would emphatically say that is not true. Everybody has a meta-narrative. And these days, that meta-narrative for many people groups is changing, absolutely.
Well, the point is that we don't really have a choice, do we? We if we're going to communicate God's grand narrative, in the best possible way, we simply have to understand the people that we're talking to and their existing stories. I mean, you make that point really well. So, but I was really interested in and appreciated the description that you made of, so we come in there and what's our attitude, what's our stance as those who come with that, wanting to tell God's story but wanting to interpret and understand what's existing. what's our attitude and the approach that we take? And, I wrote down communal, observational, relational, dialogical, and spiritual. I appreciate that, rather than we're kind of taking this superior objective view of the thing. I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit further on that, Mike.
Well, maybe just one comment, and here I might start digging a hole that I didn't want to bring the shovel to or something, but I believe that what we learn in seminaries, Bible school, and we learn this tacitly, I think, but we learn that we are the ones that have the message. We're the mouthpiece, and there's truth in this. Absolutely, we have the message. We are the ambassadors. We're to be going and telling. But that message just sort of, as it were, explicitly and tacitly just drilled into our head. You're the spokesman. You're the spokesman. You're the spokesman.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the story. You know the story. Go out there, and your job is to tell the story. Well, then when we get out there, we think our job is to tell the story. And it is after we've learned what we're telling that story into, because that'll help us to better tell the story. But I think we're trained so much at least in the Western seminaries. I don't know of a Western seminary that has a course on listening, but I'm talking about listening with intentionality of learning certain things and then using that to help us understand people to better tell the story. So just those comments briefly.
Yeah, no, good. Appreciate that. Well, I wonder if we could finish up with you telling us a story, describing how, if you can think of an example of where there's workers gone into a community, and understanding how to do this better has been effective in their ministry. Is there one example that comes to mind of group, a couple or an individual you've worked with who you've seen really come to be effective in this way?
In fact, there's so many coming that I'm going to have to sift, but maybe to preface it with, or to couch it at least in this, that I found it most helpful when working through this whole process to apply it to self first, and then to the situation that's right around me. So even though it's not directly your direct question of how have I seen this work in somebody else or another culture, but maybe just in a real practical sense, as I began to think through these things at a personal level about a decade ago, which was the hardest to do, because I think it's very difficult for us to try to dig in and figure out our assumptions and our why we think that the way we do without some outward help. But at least one area was, I grew up knowing that there's some kind of a concept of a God out there somewhere, and he's real. I think we got that through the story, the Christmas story, the Easter story, maybe at a funeral, maybe at an occasional wedding. That was there, and plus it was that time of that era in the U.S. where we were probably still living under Judeo-Christian roots. So I knew there was a God. But I also knew, again, tacitly, that God could care less about branding time on the ranch, or how much hay we got in, or whether it was a bad winter. He wasn't that had very little interest. The God had very little interest in that whatsoever. Well, it wasn't until about 10 years ago, and I began work through this, that I saw that whole mindset still was a fundamental way that I saw life. That is there a God? Now I knew I knew God personally now, and He knew me, and He called me to Himself. But it became more obvious to me that I was living and still living in the old story quite a bit. But did God exist? Yes, absolutely. But was He interested in what I was doing Tuesday afternoon? Not really. I never would have said that. But so that's the way, just in my personal life. And then in some of those kinds of things, I've seen I've seen that work out in some First Nations people's lives, some Yakutian people's lives, but that's a personal illustration, Paul, and maybe that suffices to make the point.
No, that really does, I think, exactly. And it's interesting. I don't know if I should put it in these terms, but syncretism is obviously something you address and mention in your book, something that's very prevalent, the result of much missionizing and missionary work. Syncretism, where people blend two things, or they perhaps live with two mutually contradictory things, and they can do that. And perhaps that's almost an example of a kind of syncretism that I think a lot of us in the West are, prey to, and that we have to recognize. So no, I think that's I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's an area where if somebody was coming from China or Australia and studying the evangelicals in North America, I think, and they were using this method, not that this is the only method, but it's a method. I think they would find out that we evangelicals here in North America, U.S., Canada, have more than 1 foot in the secular story of which we're unaware.
Well, there's a lot of topics we've raised that I would love to spend more time on. But yeah, very much appreciate your writing. I was going to ask, are you writing anything else, Mike? Do you have a current project at all?
Sometimes I think I should just do a book where every page is just the title of a book. And just have a book of book titles, because I might have a dozen of those going. A couple of ones that where I'm actually doing something about what's inside the title is one a book on the subject of othering, which is a big thing going on, at least I think in the world these days, and more people are becoming more familiar with the concept, but very few people are familiar with the word othering and what it actually means. So it's a book on othering, and then another sort of kind of a fly through the Bible. I think the tagline of this, the title is "It's War," just showing how the Christians are at war in the worldview arena. War is actually an acronym for Worldview Assumptions Revealed, and it's a look at each book of the Bible, the worldview assumptions that come out of that book, and then how in our whatever society we happen to be living in, how those assumptions are rival to the biblical story. And so what do we do about it? The tagline is "Flying at 30,000 feet, applying at ground zero."
Wow. That sounds fascinating. Well, we'll look forward to seeing those come out. And I can sure recommend a novel approach. And again, appreciate your ministry and the thought that you've put into these things, and how you're helping folks sharing the grand narrative. And that's what we want to see go out, don't we, of Christ.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do this, Paul. Appreciate it greatly. Yeah. And I've been looking at more and more things on your site as well. What a gold mine, absolute gold mine. Thank you for doing that.